Okay, so this is what we learned in the last podcast. Let's understand the winds on the surface. We will look at the winds above later on. So the northeast and southeast trades that are, because of Coriolis being turned into northeast and southeast winds instead of just coming south and north in either hemisphere, they are called the trade winds. You can imagine why. They could be used for sailing across the oceans for trades. And the subtropical high around 30 north is referred to as horse latitudes. It's not entirely clear where the terminology comes from, but it's assumed that the Spanish vessels, which used to carry horses plying across Europe to the Western Hemisphere, used to have to dump the horses in the middle of the ocean because the winds were so weak that sailing would become very difficult, and they would have to reduce the weight of the sailing ship. So they would simply throw away the horses overboard, and hence they were called horse latitudes. And there is another interpretation that something called a dead horse wage. So before a sailor got on these long voyages, they were paid a wage up front, and they would be worked off before they reached the destination. So it was called a dead horse pay or something like this. So you have another uh, low wind region bad for sailing. Any low wind region is bad for sailing, right? So everywhere where you have low pressure and rising air and winds are coming from either direction, the winds have to go to zero in the middle, right? So winds are coming from both sides and they are rising. So the wind speeds get very, very low in the middle where temperatures are warm, pressure is low, air is rising. So those are called equatorial doldrums. Doldrum is an English word which usually means if you're in a doldrum, that means you're feeling low, not so happy, and so on. So you have the equatorial doldrums. Later on, we'll introduce another concept called ITCZ or ITCZ, which is the intertropical convergence zone. And to the north of this subtropical high, where you have divergence into the northeast trades and towards the other direction, you have winds that are mostly from the west to east. In the atmosphere, the winds are called by the direction from which they come. So when winds come from the west, they are called westerlies. So they are basically northwesterlies, but because they are so strong and almost from the west to east, they are typically referred to as mid-latitude westerlies. And at the pole, you have wind diverging from the high pressure and Coriolis turning them from the east to west. So they are called polar easterlies. So you have mid-latitude westerlies or prevailing westerlies and polar easterlies. Something you have to think about here. Winds are westerly. The Earth is rotating from west to east, and near the surface you have winds going west to east. That means they are going ahead of the planet which is rotating. If you are near the surface, winds are also probably experiencing friction from the surface, and yet they are going faster than the planet on which they are moving, right? So obviously that means momentum is being given to them from somewhere. And if you learn the advanced concepts, you will learn that when you move air from near the low latitudes where the Earth is moving very fast, air has the momentum of the planet that's moving much faster. You can move that momentum to higher latitudes and bring it down, and that can make the winds move faster than the planet at that location, right? At these locations between 30 north and 60 north, the planet is moving much slower because it's covering smaller distance in 24 hours than in the low latitudes. Remember, on the equator we said everybody has to move at 1600 kilometers per hour to cover this distance in 24 hours, whereas at 60 north you have a much smaller distance to cover in 24 hours. So westerlies are created by imparting momentum from low latitudes to high latitudes. So these are kind of the basic structures you have to remember: Hadley cell, Ferrel cell, polar cell, trade winds, northeast and southeast trade winds. And when the ocean gets dragged by these winds, ocean currents are also going to experience Coriolis, so they are also going to start tilting according to which hemisphere they are in and which direction they are moving in, and so on and so forth. And you have to remember the mid-latitude or prevailing westerlies and the polar easterlies with rain, low pressure, bad weather in the deep tropics and in the polar front, okay, with high pressure at the poles and in the subtropical highs. Okay, so I will stop this here and we'll add a little bit more detail to this as we go along.